We can,
Oh, no, don't assume that, I'm sure people are interested in your zoning amendments.
well, apparently not.
But they're not here.
Nobody's here for that. Shall we jump right into the,
Well, either that, or you could just go into a public hearing, vote to send the amendments.
all right,
to
let's
town
do
meeting
that.
and-
We have the three, I think, three amendments. One is the,
Pretend you're a little town meeting, explain and
Oh,
list,
please.
and then you'll have, this will be like the dress rehearsal.
Mr. Johnson?
all right, the first one, well, I don't have to do it. Why don't you do it?
Cause I work on Tuesday nights. I'm
No, I
never
mean, now
available.
you can do it.
I'm never
Okay,
available.
so the first one is changing 1.35 to include the small wind energy systems ordinance, and then also including and regulations. How about sending that to town meeting? Anybody interested in doing that?
As long, assuming we don't have any public, yeah, I'll vote to send that to town meeting.
Okay,
You wanna actually move it and then,
I did just
or
move
you
it.
just, okay.
Yeah.
okay,
Second.
okay, so all those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? Don't say aye. And then the other, where's the other one? Then we're updating the variance, you're familiar with the variance now, to the state one, so that's more up to date.
That's a really good improvement.
Yeah, certainly is. Any discussion? Any lack of discussion?
I'll make a motion to send it to town meeting.
Second, anybody want to second that?
I'll second that.
All right, great. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Okay, all those opposed, and then
Controversial one.
the purposes is controversial. The purposes of the wetlands, Wetlands Conservation District objectives, including that. Any discussion?
Well, can you describe to me why we're doing this?
Because it was requested by,
Because the zoning board had looked at it, it was the only district, conservation district that did not have a set of objectives. So when they're evaluating whether something is going to meet the objectives of a district,
Mhm.
there's no objectives to be
So this
evaluated.
is a zoning board initiated one. 'Cause I didn't remember why we were doing it. So that probably answers the question for you for the town meeting. Right. I'm good with that.
you good with that? Would you like to move it?
Sure, I'll move that.
Would somebody like to second it?
I'll second
You don't sound like you mean it.
No, I-
Now, let's
No, I mean-
I wanna
I mean-
second that.
I'll second that
I will
motion.
Okay, it's seconded. All those in favor? Aye. It's rah, rah, rah. Okay, so we're done with that,
We
right?
don't have to have more public hearings on any of those.
No,
We're done.
because there was no
We're done.
And no
input,
changes.
no changes.
Right.
So we're done with that.
Right.
They
You
are
have to
gonna
close the
put-
public hearing.
All right, I'm closing thank you, I'm closing the public hearing. And what is this an informal, or is this, what is the status of this hearing?
This is not a hearing.
I mean, what is the status of this? Is this just an informal, is this
Yes,
a
just-
non-binding, or?
Yeah, just
Conversation.
conversation about their proposal.
Okay, all right, well, why don't you come up, you know the whole
This has been
drill by minute.
submitted as a petition, right?
It has been submitted by a petition, all the,
Do you have copies?
yes, I do have copies.
And so.
Why don't you come up?
And so we need to hold a hearing on this, and then we can either support it or not support it.
Right, and the-
So this is now a fait accompli, right? I mean,
Right.
this is,
It had to be done by yesterday.
so this is done. All right,
Yeah.
so, and so the hearing for this would be when?
I would suggest the wording of the RSA is at the next available, planning board meeting. So
Well, then let's do that.
that would be January, hold on a second, I
14th,
think it's
it
14th.
is the 14th.
Okay, all right.
1 month ahead of Valentine's Day, so everyone,
Ah.
someone to think about, to start.
All right. So did you wanna,
Yes,
I mean, we'll
fine.
obviously have questions, and I'll
Right.
just say that I just had about, not a very long time to
Right.
look at this, so I'll have a lot of questions which,
I don't
maybe,
even, yeah,
You
well,
all
I'm
have
just-
a copy of it.
yeah,
Sorry.
I have one that's in many colors.
So
Yes.
why don't you start
Mine came
with,
in mini
Oh,
copies.
yes, okay, well, that's because Jonathan taught us how to draft it, which is,
Oh.
they should all.
Well, they do.
All right.
all right, so why don't you start?
So we, like, we came and saw you last month, and we listened as carefully as we possibly could. And we tried to draft something that, would not just be for us, and would meet, a social need, but would be simple as possible, and would have as modest an impact as possible. And ideally, what we'd love is you guys would walk through it and show you what we're trying to, and say, what a great idea, we're gonna draft something similar to this, and we'll propose it ourselves for March. Failing that, you might say, well, this is something that we would, be willing to support. So those are the two options that, or not support, so those are the options that we see. And maybe then, so what we did is, using strike-through, that's why you have the color. So basically, we try to build on what the town has. So planned development is something that's been suggested over time as a useful strategy to consider. So what you're looking at here essentially is to allow planned development within 1 mile of the Lyme Common District.
So that's north and south,
Yeah, north and south,
It's all,
on Route 10.
but just
No,
on, just on Route 10.
right.
Okay. And all that planned development would do would allow multiple units of housing rather than single dwelling units. We're not proposing changing the footprint. We're not proposing changing the size of lots or anything like that. So externally, it would look the same, but instead of being big houses, they would be smaller units within the same
How
size.
can that be if you're putting them all together?
Well,
Yeah,
planned
right.
developments do allow clustering.
Right, I know, but they are all touching. I mean, you've set it up so they can all be touching.
Well, the reason that the touching is there, that's a good question, is because.
Well, but you shouldn't, I don't think it's fair to represent, just as you have, what you're proposing, if you have a specific provision that allows all the buildings to touch, because effectively, that will look like one big building.
Well, what we try to do there is, of course, it's still subject to site plan review. And what we would do, I can't say what another developer would do, but first of all, remember, this is just for any developer who will agree to make 50% of the units for senior housing.
Well, let me
So,
ask
you want
about,
to walk through it
let me,
one by
let me
one?
ask about this, I mean, we'll have questions if you don't mind as we go, as things come up.
Yeah,
And so, when, you know, you're defining senior housing as dwellings in which at least one resident is 55 years of age or older. And again, forgive me, because I just read this. and-
sure,
and,
no, let's walk through.
So I
it.
had to, you know, I'm trying to catch up with what you've obviously been over. But my understanding is that there are two ways for there to be senior housing officially. One is at 62 and over, where it's 100%, and the other is the 80%, 55, with one 55-year-old in the house. Is that also your understanding?
My understanding is if you're gonna get, federal government money for senior housing.
Right,
You're right, there's two ways to do it.
Right.
One is the 62 and older, and the other is 80% of the units have to have one person who's
55 years
and
or older,
right?
with the intent that it be sold to people 55 or over, with the 20% being a, you know, a variable. You can have other ages.
Other ages
Yeah.
or, right.
So, essentially, I mean, I
But
have,
we're not intending to apply for federal
Okay,
government funding for this,
but,
so
but
we
when,
can
when
assure
you
that-
say senior housing, I find that a little misleading. You're
Okay, that's
defining
fine.
senior housing as 50% of people who are 55 years or older. I'm just telling you how I feel about it. You know, my preference is 100% 62 years or older. That's really senior housing. to me.
So 55 doesn't cut
A
it for
single
you?
person at 55, I mean, first of all, in the federal program, there are verification codes, there's ways of dealing with, if people move out, the single 55-year-old in the house. So how is Lyme going to enforce that? Are we gonna go in there and say, oh, the person who's 55 years old has left, and now you have to get out of your apartment?
Died.
I mean, how are we gonna even do that?
Well, David would do night checks. Twice a week. I mean,
No, I mean, really, it's a burden on the town. We don't wanna be looking
Well, I
into
think
people's apartments
One
and
of
stuff.
the things would be to, you know, place a covenant on a particular number of units that are, and at the time of the development, and say,
You mean-
these
you mean
are,
Yeah,
if
but
you're
you
going.
still have to check.
You still
You
have
still,
to
right, you
check.
still have to check.
And on
it is
on a
as-
practical level, how are we gonna do that?
And
I
what if
mean,
those people go on sabbatical and they wanna lease their place to a young couple?
Yeah, well, very
You know,
true.
it's like,
That's-
you
And
know,
what happens if they die? Are you gonna be
Or
willing
say
to
it's an
Well,
older
yeah,
person.
so-
go throw the other
Like
side
a
of the
cougar who
apartment?
marries a 20-year-old.
Okay, let's so my question is one of enforcement.
So would that be any different if Lyme wanted 100% senior housing?
If it was 100%, there would be the federal program, and there are verification codes, and you are legally bound to it. With us as a town, in other words, as a town, we would have access to the federal, and, you know, we could enforce it through the federal program. But for us to be a municipality sending people around, I don't know how it would work, and I think the
So
burden.
one of the questions
burden is on
would
you.
have-
The burden is on you, you're defining it in a way that is not officially senior housing. You are saying, this is what we consider senior housing, here's our definition. And my problem is, first of all, I don't think that's great. But second of all, assuming we accept that, I shouldn't say we, assuming the town passes that, how is the town gonna enforce it? And that's what I wanna know from you.
So your assumption would be only senior housing Lyme would, this is a question,
Yeah.
Lyme would allow is if it had federal funding.
I didn't say that, you know, I really wish you wouldn't
You don't
say what
have
I
any.
said. I said that's my preference. I'm asking you, don't ask me, I'm asking you, how do we enforce this?
And I'm trying really hard to figure out what your concerns are.
Suppose this passes as it is written here, how do we enforce that 50% of dwelling units have to have someone at least 55 years older in them? How does the town enforce that?
Well, I guess what I would wanna do is, if that seems to be a problem, find out how other towns do it, because I'm sure this wouldn't be the first town in the United States facing that
Do
issue.
you know of any other towns that do, at 50%?
Well, that's why I asked if the 100% was,
But John's point is that the federal government has protocols in place on how to,
but there's lots of
Did you
senior
look back?
housing that isn't federally funded, like the Kendall community where my mother lives. That's not federally funded.
Yeah, but Kendall is clearly a senior housing. I've worked there for 15 years, I know it very well. We're not talking about Kendall.
Well, so what happens
What's
when
the
you guys
difference?
wanna move in with a kid, you have to leave the co-housing because
Right.
it's really not good. All you can find is, a young couple in their 40s who wanna buy it. What
Well,
happens
that's the
then?
same problem that
Well, I'm
anything
asking you,
that's
how are you gonna
dedicated.
feel? I
You
mean,
can't sell it unless,
So you guys aren't gonna be able to sell your house?
well, the demographics don't suggest that that's gonna be a problem. That our problem, and most people who are building houses now, see that the people who, we're getting older, there are not younger people moving to New England generally.
All right, so, I mean, I told you what,
So your concern
Well,
is
I told you
the
what my
town
concern is.
enforcement.
No,
Yes,
I'm
yes.
not
And you
gonna
don't
get an
see a
answer.
difference between 50% and 100%. Or that's a question.
This is John.
I see a difference, and what Eric said is the difference, that there's a federal protocol in place where this is basically, you're setting the standard, you're saying a single 55-year-old in the unit makes it senior housing. At 50% as opposed to 80% with all the protocols associated with that. So I think the burden is upon you, because you are presenting this to us, to explain to us how we as a town can make that work, if it's passed.
Okay, well, then that's a reasonable.
Yeah,
we'll
that's
make
all
that
I'm
work.
asking, how would you do
How
that?
would you make it work?
You know, or how would you have us do it, is really the question, because I really don't know, and I don't really want us poking into people's
Right.
apartments, like, who's, you know, lifting up and who's in here, are you 55 years old?
What do you guys do for, Hanover High School? I know what Hanover does to check, I don't know what you do for Lyme.
What do you mean?
Check for
People who
55-year-olds
move
in the high
So
school,
the families who
they
move
should,
in
if they're still in
to
there at
use
that
the
point.
Hanover school system?
Yeah, they have to be 4 nights a week, right?
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah, it has to be 4 nights a week, so I assume that the town checks the same way Norwich and,
Checks what?
It's not the town, it's
If you-
the school
if you
district
move
that
into
check.
town-
It's not the town. The school gets lots of money, the town doesn't.
And
I
you have
see
a
that
house
the real
somewhere
issue
else.
being that, the way sales work is that a property is sold, and the deed is signed, sent up to Grafton County, and then when Grafton County processes it, they hold on to them for a little while and then send us a large number of them to update our information. And so if a sale goes through, it could be 6 months prior to the town knowing that the sale has gone through, so you could have an issue where somebody buys the property and moves in, and then I'm gonna come around and say, hey, by the way, no, you can't do this.
well, I assume that there would be a contractual easement or some,
Well, that's
there
what
would be a
we're,
way
I think
to-
John's
yeah.
asking, is there going to be a way of enforcing
Well, there
that?
I
should
think
be a
it's
way
not-
where the
it's not
town
a-
isn't put in a position, and it should be that there's some housing trust, and that's their job, they do that kind of stuff, that would then manage this for you guys,
You know, I'm
But
not,
that's,
Yeah.
right,
to make
I mean,
sure
I
that
think
you're in
there's,
compliance with the zoning.
right,
Because if not, the whole development is got a
Right.
big problem.
so this is, I'm asking this from the point of view, is let's assume this passes.
right.
I'm not, this isn't even, you know, let's assume it passes. I'm asking in that context, what do we do? So I think it would be nice, since this is your amendment, if you could come up with some approach for us
Right.
vis-à-vis that.
So, and if the town were ever interested in, supporting housing for seniors of some percentage, then the town would probably propose some sort of an entity, to manage it in the same way.
But we're talking about your
Well, the
amendment.
town of Hanover hires people in the city of Lebanon Housing Authority to manage their senior housing. The town of Hanover is basically giving their senior housing to Twin Pines, so
Uh-huh.
that they don't have to manage it. And that's a town-sponsored project, that's not private development with a covenant or, you know, restriction on who can live there.
Uh-huh,
So it's not like that Lyme's inadequate. The fact is, it takes a lot of people power to manage that type of thing, and, you know, Lyme doesn't have that now.
okay, well, that's helpful, I mean, certainly, as we've mentioned before, we've talked to Twin Pines about managing, any workforce housing we built. And if they would, if there's somebody local doing senior, that would be great, there's also a national senior co-housing, component, and that might also be another way to do it.
So they would screen everybody who
They
moved
could
into
do
your
the screening.
development.
Well, what Andrew Winter said is that we could pay them to do the screening,
Mhm.
which makes great sense to me.
Yep,
So,
Well, that's
so,
an
so
answer.
that setup then would be applicable to anybody who did this? I mean, I'm, again, thinking of it from the point of
From the
view of
screening.
Lyme.
if we get 10 of these developments,
suppose we get
is
10.
Twin Pines gonna be able to do it all, not just your
Not just
I
clinical
don't
yours.
know,
house?
that's an interesting question, and I don't know how much their focus is on senior,
They're
as
taking
opposed
over
to-
the Hanover senior housing as
Well,
soon
then
as
I
it goes
bet-
through. I'm not sure how much it
As
is.
long as it's an income producer. for
I think
them.
it would behoove you to look into this, you're gonna be asked this question by
Yeah.
other people than us.
Right,
So,
Okay.
it's just, it's
So
in
we need a
your,
better answer for it.
it's your interest
Yeah.
to come up with a good answer.
If this passes, whose responsibility is it to monitor? Is it ours or is it theirs?
Well, they've gotta show that they're zoning compliant. Ultimately, you know, the whole place gets shut down if they're not zoning compliant.
Yeah, I
And you're
assume,
setting up the zoning, so,
And it would be ongoing, I mean, it would
right,
have to
there
be
would,
done.
there might be
once.
something that could be set up, because it would be subject to site plan review, that,
You write it in them.
the board would insist that there be a monitor, that you pay
Right.
for a monitor.
We could make conditions.
Right, and so there could be a condition
Right.
that it is monitored and,
Yes,
Yeah, I guess I'm a little confused, because the description of planned development includes, business or industrial, I don't have my eyeglasses.
Institutional.
Institutional. It seems to me where you're talking about a residential, period.
We used the language from the town's plan development, so anybody that had a business and a residential in combination, which is what plan development assumes for Lyme.
yeah, but I think what she's asking is, are you a mixed use or are you just residential?
We would, our business is the lodge.
it's on a separate lot.
Yeah,
Well, it's actually,
It's, you subdivided that big lot, it's now on a separate lot.
well, that would be okay. There's nothing to keep us from adding lodging to that lot.
well, to which lot?
The 98 acres, its lodging is a permitted use in the district.
You mean as you're writing it?
Yeah, I could see that you could add lodging, you would take up units,
Yeah, it would take up the square footage.
in the number of units that it would be considered.
Well, would they be residential units?
The plan development, it doesn't differentiate between residential and business units. You're allowed a certain number of units, however mixed those are.
Right, and 15% has to be residential.
Right.
Well, that's not gonna be a problem for them.
No, but at least 15%.
Well, that's possible. Yeah, John, we had some struggles trying to understand what the ordinance said there, and so, the total units, would include, yeah, I think that would make sense.
So this would permit businesses in your,
Yes.
So you would do lodging, mixed use of lodging?
And residential.
And what would the distinction be between the lodging units and the residential units?
Well, the definition, I don't know as well as you guys do, but for the lodging, it's, I think it says transient,
Yeah,
you have to look at it. It's
if you were
temporary.
to, put several cabins on the larger of the two lots
Right.
now, and operate them out of the main lodge, I think that would.
But that would be part of the dimensional control.
Oh, absolutely, it would take up,
Yes.
it would take up space and it would take up units.
Yeah.
Okay, so,
Back in Article 2, it says that it will provide private homes and shared facilities to residents of the community and guests, which sounds like you can't rent a room off to strangers.
Well, I think that, in the mixed use, you could have a garage. You're not proposing that we ever would, but.
Automobile garage,
An automobile repair facility,
right.
and
If
a
that were
residential
permitted use
facility.
in the
Right,
rural area.
and so,
Yeah, but again, I think, if I understand you correctly, you're saying your definition could be a problem.
Well, that's the housing definition, not the business definition, if
Okay,
that
okay,
helps.
okay.
Yeah, but
So,
you would have in item 5, the plan development in the rural district shall be organized as a cooperative housing co-housing unless the planning board approves another type of multi-unit housing. So you're basically limiting it to housing. I don't see how you've,
the wording is a problem.
the wording, you have one, in the definition saying plan development is a mixed use.
Right.
And then here, you're saying it is going to be, multi-unit housing or cooperative housing, co-housing. Those are, you don't have, any provision for the business use.
Does Lyme have other experience approving plan developments that are mixed use?
So what's that got to do with this issue?
Well, I'm just looking, because we're trying to follow Lyme's model, trying
Um,
to be as close as possible.
I don't recall one in recent,
But wasn't,
Wayne Pike, it's gotta be mixed
You know,
use.
Wayne Pike is absolutely a planned development, but
And what about Riches up
85
at,
Dartmouth College Highway, was that originally planned?
that was here before
That was
zoning.
pre-zoning.
But what about Riches with the, insurance, post office and residential
Or is
units?
that just a home?
And Lyme
home?
Center? It's Lyme Center.
I'd have to, it was never, it was always mixed use before zoning,
I see,
so it really is not.
I see, yeah, it hasn't happened.
But in any case, we're dealing with your wording, not,
Right.
you know, what not, there is no.
Well, you could, I mean, guests probably gives you some flexibility on that.
It might. It might, but your
Although it would
wording,
limit the sort of
but
business
your,
you had.
but
it
your
would work for
wording
us,
is the
but-
problem.
Right,
A plan development in the rural district shall be organized as a cooperative housing co-housing unless the planning board approves another type of multi-unit housing. There- And so that's pretty cut and dry. It doesn't give you any wiggle room,
So that there would be no business in the RR. but
which
could
doesn't
be
make any
this.
sense, really,
It's kind of,
because
it's a conflict.
it's a conflict with the intent of a planned development. So look, you're taking these notes, let's just go through our questions, we don't need to, you know,
Solve them.
solve them,
We can't.
we can't.
This is amendment.
unless you said this is
Right, but
a good
let's
idea.
go through it and see what the issues are, and then we can
Right.
have a different discussion.
You know, it'd be so great if this had come in 2 months earlier, and then we could be sitting around, like, you know, working this together, rather than this being like what's going to town meeting.
We couldn't agree more.
Okay. And here we are again.
That's what we hoped would happen in June. I think that there's been, but here we are.
But what happened, I guess is my question. I mean, this, you
Yeah,
could
I'm
have,
not sure how.
you could have easily brought this to us, you know,
Last month.
last month.
Well, we, one of the things that we did last month was to ask some questions about what would interest you, what might be useful to you, what suggestions we could offer, and then what you might think about. So, I wish we had been here before, earlier, yes.
Yeah,
And
well,
maybe that's all we can say now, is that we think we did our best to be here earlier, and,
are you implying that, I mean, I understood that you, at the rehearing, you said that you expected us to come up with language, but that we didn't come up with language, is that right?
we would love to work
No, but I'm asking,
with the
because
board
I
in
get,
a
I get
two-way
I'm
exchange.
getting a feeling, and I've been through this before, where the implication is that in some way the planning board hasn't been cooperative or worked fast enough for you. Is that your feeling?
We don't want you especially, John, to take this personally on anybody.
But let them all take it personally, because
I think it's fair to say that we expect the planning board to say, there's an issue here, how can we work with these people to come up with something that will work for the town and for the landowner?
I think, you know, I'll just tell you, for me personally, and I'm sure, I'm sure for everybody else that they can say no, is, we acted with the best of faith. You're essentially, in fact, with the last meeting, after the first 2 meetings, when you went away, I remember Rich saying, we're very happy with what we heard, we're gonna go away and we'll come back with specific language. You have the videos. I think that's what you said. You can go back and check, because I am getting into the senior housing phase myself, but That's what I remember clearly, and I remember the next week, I said, I thought you guys were coming back the next week. And you were gone, and this has happened over the years, you come and you go, and then it gets to be the last second. And we get a zoning amendment like this, where there's nothing we can do.
Well, if this is something that interests
This
you,
accomplishes nothing.
All right, let's move
you
along.
can pick up on what you like about it and say, well, we can't do anything this week, but this is still something we care about. Just
Okay.
because we go away doesn't mean the problem goes away.
No, I certainly don't assume that.
Right. So where are we on this?
Can I ask some questions?
Go.
What are the maximum number of units that a developer can have with no workforce housing? Is that 30?
30.
So you can have 30 with no workforce housing.
No. Oh, no, not with no workforce.
Well, that-
In no
Well,
case
yeah, yes,
shall
the
it
max
exceed 30.
Would be 30,
But the max would be 30, that's what I thought.
that's right.
Okay, so
But that would include,
if you had your
workforce.
50% where you had one 55-year-old in the unit, you could have 30 units.
no.
Well,
This would allow 30, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
this allows 30,
Right.
right, if you had.
If you had enough,
If you had enough property, if you had a large enough parcel, you could have,
Oh,
enough footprint.
right, so if you
And, but you would be
qualify,
maxed, you would be capped at 30 units.
so if you had the qualifications,
Right,
you could get as many as 30 if you had the 50% thing, but you wouldn't have to have any workforce housing. So
that's right.
so that what I'm trying to understand, the workforce housing is strictly optional.
right.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's what I wanted to understand.
And still, if you could get 30 units without workforce housing,
Yes.
you could not take advantage of the additional 20%.
That's right.
Right,
That's our sense, is
Right.
that the town is very concerned about that, so that's why
Okay.
we propose that.
and do you have any sense of how many properties, north and south, would be affected by this?
Yeah, how far down does a mile go from? the end of
Well,
this?
I have an old map, but I'm interested in,
Is this measured along Route 10? Or is
Yeah.
it measured
Yeah.
from center point of the common, or how's that,
It's from the boundary of
the
the Lyme
boundary of the Lyme
district.
Common District
Right.
along Route
All
10?
along Route 10. And it only applies to properties with frontage within 1 mile of that
of
boundary.
So
Route
does
10
the-
north and
And how
south.
deep off of Route 10?
They have to have frontage on Route 10.
But it can be that whole property, even if
Yes.
the
Right.
part of the property that's being developed isn't within a mile. It just has to have a point that touches Route 10 within a mile of the common.
Right.
But
So-
the development doesn't have to be
So
there.
did you do any sort of a build out or a sense of what the maximum impact could be, or anything like that?
I mean, the number of lots.
Well, basically a build out, like if these properties were developed under this provision, what the impacts would be.
Well, we don't know, how many 90-acre parcels would generate 4 building lots. We know ours, we only get 4 building lots on 92 acres.
But there's,
But
Is
there's a
that
different.
calculation been
well-
done?
Well, I think John's asking a slightly different question.
Yeah,
which
that's a
is
totally
how
different
many-
question.
How many properties could be developed this way? And, okay, so this property has 7 acres.
Right,
And
what could they do?
what could they do? And they might be able to have very small residential.
I mean, if the
Right.
7 acres generated a yield of 3 acres, then they could have,
They could have bump square feet of
Well,
footprint.
basically, when people are proposing a major change to zoning, they've done their due diligence about, well, how is this gonna affect the town? And then, so that's sort of what I'm asking, what are the impacts? You're providing a tremendous amount of development potential for, I took a quick look at the map, but it looks like a, substantial number of properties, what would that mean in terms of population potential, school, taxes, the whole deal?
The lot behind Wagner is all subdivided. And that, I don't know how many you get.
Yeah. Well, we don't know, that's what I'm
A
asking.
bunch.
Well, even the smaller lots, they're at 3 acre zoning, for all, these new lots, you would have a fair number of lots.
So the
that-
Purcell's lot, for example, is that within a mile or is that?
No, that's way south.
Out?
Yeah.
But Danny Bailey's is there, I have a map somewhere, oh, here it is, right in front of me, I'm not
I
surprised.
think you'd be almost up to about the Lyme Clinic would be about a,
Line plan as far as it can go.
I don't think you go,
Lyme Glen,
The Hitchcock.
oh, okay, here's, because this is from your old one.
Right, thank
So,
you.
I think this- See, I mean, in your old amendment, you had the 40 acre limit.
Right.
This has no provision for, so that means to all of these property, this is the,
Yeah,
so that means all of these properties, and there's a lot of them on Route 10, now qualify for, planned development,
Mhm.
which is, pretty intense. So that's what I'm asking is.
all right, I think we could certainly come back and say, although we don't know, I mean, one would have assumed 90 acres, which, when we first bought it with 3 acre zoning, we would have assumed you might get 30 units, and then, no, it's only 4 units.
We've
So
been
we
over this
can't-
so
no,
many
no,
times.
so I can't
Let's
guess.
not go back down
We
that road.
can't guess how many those would generate, we can say how many lots there are, how many existing lots there are, and what their, real acreage is.
Well, one thing you could
Right.
do is you could
Right.
count up the number of properties affected, which I
Yeah.
really would have assumed you would have done before you wrote the article. Count up the number of properties that this will affect, at the very least, that's a starting
Yeah,
point.
that's a good starting point.
Yeah, but there are less properties that would be eligible for planned development than this map shows, because
Right.
this is only, it's not all these, it's just
No,
these.
it's just, here's the red line, it's only the
Right.
ones on the red line.
Right, exactly.
So we can count those up.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, anybody wants to look at that?
I would imagine that would be a question at Little Town Meeting.
I would think so.
So, and the question about the, and again, this is wording, a lot of these questions are, if we had had more time, they're just words, and it's like, well, you change the words, but, resident designed, and I'm just wondering, I know what you mean,
Right,
but, again, is that enforceable for us? I mean, do we go, how do we even do that?
Well, it's resident designed at the beginning, and then once it's sold off, it's no longer resident
Right,
designed.
so,
And,
I think that wording is really problematic, because what you're saying is, it has to be resident designed, and it's not going to be after it's built.
I questioned the built also, is it built by the residents?
this is the definition of co-housing that's been used, a lot of places would pulled it from that. If, I think if I run the planning board, I probably would be ridiculous and say there might be other multi-unit, developments that you would allow, and not just have co-housing, which is why we said.
But the way you've written it
Right.
is it's optional, so we can't count on a future planning board
Right,
allowing that. So if the future planning board doesn't allow that, then it's restricted to this definition.
right.
And I just don't think it
Well,
serves, I don't think it
resident
serves
built,
you well.
once it's built, it's built.
Yeah, I know,
But is what,
And they don't.
when it's, does that mean the residents build it? Or does that
Resident
mean?
built, designed, and it doesn't mean you go in and build it yourself. If I say I'm building a house, that doesn't mean I'm going out and constructing it, right?
Right.
Yeah, so built in that sense.
And-
So it's being built for somebody who's gonna buy it or own it.
Well, with co-housing, you have a committee, and you agree on your design, and then you hire your builder, and there might be some sweat equity in it, some people have done that.
But there's no, according to this definition, there is no committee.
Yeah, and the
It
other
just
thing
said-
is that you couldn't hire a property management company because it's supposed to be resident managed.
Most co-housing is self-managed, and they hire managers to help them with their
But
management.
you're,
Well,
but
it
this
says
is,
resident managed.
It doesn't say exclusively resident managed.
well,
The plain
why don't you
language
say it at all?
says-
this is what you're,
Fair manages it
this is
personally,
what
but
you're
this is what
writing.
this says.
I'm not saying this from the point of view of, oh, you know, good or bad.
Right.
I'm pointing out, you are gonna run into problems with this, because a board is gonna read this as it's written, what it means. And believe, I mean, I've had enough experience on various planning boards, different incarnations, where people read things a lot of different ways. And you're opening yourself up to a lot of problems with this wording. I'm telling you this, I'm really trying to tell you this for your own good, it's not adversarial. The wording is a problem for you, because people will interpret it in a way that will restrict you, or future projects.
Well, if you just read it literally, that's what it says.
It's, yeah,
Resident managed.
it will be read literally.
And so that's the thing, is like, if you don't really mean that, it shouldn't be said that way, it's just,
What resident managed means is that the residents are ultimately responsible for their homes. But there's
but that
nothing to
doesn't
say
say
you
that.
can't.
I mean, I would have said, oh, that means that they're hiring, that they are, you know, doing all the management, all the finances, all the property improvements. You know, you manage a property, you're taking care of the shutters and the clapboards and, and,
Yeah, it's really hard, because I think that's why we just spent 8 months trying to do just 3 zoning amendments.
Yeah,
Because
it's
we
not
go
easy.
over it, and, you know, it's
Yeah.
hard.
And I
It's
can,
really hard.
I can tell you that with all these fine people who you know well, that trying to come to a consensus is not an easy thing. So the clearer the language, that's really a lot of what we have been working on, trying to work on with the zoning amendments, is to make the wording as clear as possible. You know, and like the thing with the wetlands objective, the zoning board said, you will help us by making this clearer. And what I'm seeing in here, and this is not adversarial, this is for your own good, is the wording is gonna cause you problems. I mean, aside from any of the substance, you express things in ways that are gonna be a problem, I can assure you.
so, yeah, and then can I just, if this then presumes that if you had an existing structure, you wouldn't be able to put co-housing in it because it wouldn't be resident designed and built? Is that?
No. I mean, I can put my
Well-
lawyer hat on here and say, that's not what an interpretation would be. A resident can redesign something.
Okay, well, it doesn't say redesign or rebuild or renovate, it says design, build, and manage. So it just,
Well, I hear that you're reading it that way, and.
well, that's what it says,
Mhm.
but that's not what you intend it to mean.
And
really.
that hasn't, as I understand it, that's not how it's been interpreted across the country. But if there's a better way to say that the people who are gonna live there hire the architect, approve the design, hire the builders, work on it if they want to, I mean, I don't know how
Is
you
it
would break it up.
necessary to even have this
Well,
here?
yeah,
Well, we would have said multi-unit housing, but people have expressed a concern with that in Lyme, so we thought limiting it, would be useful, but as we said, or, you know, if you were the planning board, you might say, we would approve multi-unit housing.
I would. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't care if you're co-housing, frankly. I
Right.
think it's just adding a lot of complexity, which we don't need, and it also, you know.
So
is-
you, let me understand you, so you would approve multi-housing up and down a mile, north and south on all those property?
That's all this is.
But,
mean,
no, but is
As
it,
I drive by, guess what, I don't know who's owning, designing and
but I'm
managing
asking you,
it.
would you,
Do I want that? No, I don't think that's appropriate.
that's what I'm asking.
But I'm also saying it's like, from how I see it as I'm driving by, it's no different, the look of what this is presenting as compared to some
yeah.
other form of management.
But
No,
would you,
The
would
same
you,
as Barrel
It's like
Farms, for instance, or
property
Hemlock
doesn't care
Ridge.
whether it's rented or sold.
right,
Right, okay, so.
So it could be the same as Barrel Farms or Hemlock Ridge or any
Well,
of
those people, those are condominiums that are owned by individual people, they have a board
Right.
that, you know, makes decisions about whether they pave the driveway this year or not. And they all pay an assessment to manage the common property, that's a condo,
alright, well,
you know?
there's somebody who feels that way about it.
I don't see why, you know. And then what happens if people hate having a co-housing situation, we have this thing built, and you guys don't wanna do co-housing anymore, and, you know, you want Purcell to come in and manage it, and you know. Then the planning board is put into a position where we have this multi-million-dollar thing sitting on Route 10 that's gonna be vacant unless they approve it to be a multifamily house that is no longer co-housing.
So if you were drafting it, you'd just say multi-unit.
I would, but I would also maybe have different limitations on what could be built and not have structures that could be 30 units glommed together with all the common houses also glommed on too. So, yeah, that'd be,
And we try, I think we asked this last time, but how would you deal with handicap access? Because
how would I
that's,
deal with
that's why we're
handicap
trying to
access?
attach the
Everything you
buildings.
build is gonna be handicapped accessible. Most buildings that have handicapped access have a ramp or a lift.
But
or an
we're trying to
elevator.
build for fragile people who aren't gonna go outside in the winter. That's why we want to put the
Every
buildings together.
new public building that's constructed has to have handicapped access.
But if we build, if I build a house here and a house here, and the kitchen's over here,
Mhm.
unless they're connected, then my 93-year-old mother's gonna have to put on a coat and go out in her wheelchair, and I wanna connect them so that she doesn't have to do that. Or the 93-year-old me. That's why we wanna put some of them together.
Well, maybe some of them, this says all of them can be put together.
Well, I bet,
Well, that's what it says.
that's right.
And if I were
then
you,
by
that's
site
what I
plan-
would build, because that's what you've been talking about building all along, is a single unit, you know, a single structure that's very efficient because it's all together. And of course, I would assume that if this gets passed, that that's what we're gonna get, is 30 units plus all the common stuff all hung off of one structure that are called separate buildings, because that's how you set this up, but it's,
so is that right? I mean, I was wondering about that.
I don't know, you could ask them,
could
that's
get,
what
you
I
could
read
get,
in
that's how I
number
interpret it,
7, but-
that the way this is written, you could get, you could have one building with 30 units in it.
So long as the number of units doesn't exceed the total
Right.
number allowed in the development.
So you
I
could
mean,
have a,
that's-
you could
you
have
don't
a
get a
30,
bonus.
30,
But the original language was retained, that there shall be no more than 6 units per building.
But they can
What's
put
the
the buildings
definition of
together.
connected
But they can
buildings?
connect.
When they're connected, how do we
Well, that's
differentiate them from
where
one
the,
building or two
you know,
buildings?
that's the semantic of it, say, well, these two pieces are separate buildings. And since there is no way of defining,
so in reality, you could have
if
30
you're going-
units in a building,
In a-
with a small connection.
Or, well, you could say that you're going to abut the two buildings together, put a firewall between them, and say they are two separate buildings.
Yeah.
And they could share a common roof line, they could share common walls, you wouldn't know there was a difference. You could have a motel-like building with 30 units in it, that it's broken up 6 units with a firewall in between them and saying, these are separate buildings. You know, since there is no way of defining that.
That's how it goes.
So it really,
You can also have covered and heated walkways.
Kendall has that, my mom was able
Do
to
they?
do that until she was 91, and then it didn't work anymore.
Well, that's,
And of course, we're trying to build something that we can live there and not have to move to Kendall or another place like that.
Why would this, as years went by and the residents got older, turned out to be a kennel?
Why wouldn't it turn?
Mm.
Well, because we're gonna work hard to try and have younger people live there too, but there's no guarantees. We just, we'll try very hard to have younger people live there. There's all sorts of, some co-housing is for seniors only, without any federal, supports. And some co-housing is intergenerational, and we wanna live with kids, so that's why it would be intergenerational.
Back 2 years ago, whatever, you gave us a description of co-housing, and I believe you told us the percentage of places that were successful. Do you remember that?
I think we got a letter from the co-housing board, once people build, it was like 99% or something like that.
I think, actually, I
something
think it was
really
100,
high.
I think they were not aware of any co-housing projects that were built that failed, that they're successful.
A lot of people get started, oh, we'd love to do it, but once something is built, the national figure is 100% success.
100%.
Right.
That's my memory, and, you know, we can look up whatever the
That's amazing.
cohousing.org sent us, yeah.
You cited a lot of the research that the smaller ones fail as part of the reason you wanna have so many units is to keep it moving.
Sustainable,
So,
right, yeah.
are there smaller ones that have failed and have they just not been built, or have they been built and failed?
I think that's a really good question, and I can go back and look at that. I remember going on a tour up in Washington State, and at some of the ones, I think it had 12 or 14, and they said, we wish we were bigger, because it's hard to have the sort of diversity that we want. And so what people have said is, our advice is not to be smaller, but I don't think that means that those have actually failed, at least yet.
I think it's
I think they're
much
gonna make
more
them bigger rather than.
it's a realization that,
It's
hard, yeah.
I see your
Yeah.
point for sure, that
Right.
critical mass is
Yeah.
important.
So I'm thinking what's happening, and we can find out, is that they're getting bigger rather than closed.
Right.
All right.
Well, Kendall wants to expand in the worst way, and they've got 250 units, not counting the care facility.
They just wanna make.
Not counting the what?
The
Not,
care
not
facility.
counting the beds in the
Primary or whatever.
well, people move on to that,
Mhm.
But they just
assisted
wanna,
living.
they just wanna make more money, that's what it is.
I don't believe Kendall is profit-making, I believe it's the Quaker nonprofit.
It's, you know.
Well, that doesn't matter, whether,
it's just an
whatever,
economic
whatever their
model.
motivation is.
Right, well, it's to keep the facility going,
Yeah.
and they feel like they need more in order to support the facility,
Right.
so.
They don't pay the salary.
I will say, you know, I think part of it is that in their economic model, they didn't expect people to live as long as they do. And also require such intensive care
Right,
at
at
the
the
end of
end of-
life, so that it's more expensive than they originally.
But are you bringing that up in
Well,
relation to?
well,
Yeah.
I mean, if all of a sudden every one of those 30 units is occupied by, 80 and 90-year-olds,
So,
I mean-
but again, we're only talking about,
30 units.
yeah, we're only talking about one potential development. We've got a whole strip there.
Yeah,
of-
we do.
I mean, if Kendall was interested in expanding, they could buy some acreage and build a place, a satellite place in Lyme.
Yeah.
I think
They did
there's a
buy-
difference, you know,
But
certainly.
They want they're providing the care, I mean,
Yes.
you guys aren't providing the care, I mean, I guess,
Specifically not our plan.
until you have.
Right.
I don't know, maybe you use some of your common space to have a clinic, I mean,
Well, it would be,
Paperthorne
I
has a
think
clinic.
they've discovered that it's cheaper if you have these elderly in 6 units or 10 units to share caregivers and
Sure.
rather than having
Yeah.
separate.
Yeah, Ellen has talked about that, the parish nurse, some about the benefits
Yeah.
here in the senior housing.
Well, I can
Certainly
tell
the
you
home
caregivers
health
around the clock are very expensive.
Right. So, and there actually is a thread, this is a little off the side, but there's a co-housing listserv discussion, and they've been talking recently about how people are sharing the cost of caregivers
Mhm.
in co-housing, which is certainly something we imagine we'd be able to do.
All right, let's,
How did you come up with the 55 years number? Why 55?
From that federal government, there's two ways they define, if they're gonna fund senior housing, they have a 62 and over, or 80% 55 and over, and we thought if we put the 80% 55 and over here, it would be just an unnecessary complication, so we just said 50% of all the units will be senior housing, rather than 80% of the 50% will be senior. That seemed complicated. One of the challenges about getting federal funding for housing is then the senior has to be, as I understand it, the senior has to be physically separate from the other. And we don't wanna segregate people who are 55 and over.
the 55, the 80%, I don't think they have to be segregated. It's just 80-20. The other one is, the 62 and over is 100%.
Right, but if you had the 80-20, if this were the 80-20 and this were the market rate, the 80-20 and the market rate couldn't be next to each other. You'd have to have separate buildings or
I'm
separate
following you.
spaces.
Hmm.
Let's call this the 55 and over,
Right.
senior, and this is the market rate units. So if you
You
had.
mean the 20% when you said
No,
market?
the 20% would be in here,
Okay,
except we haven't proposed the 20%. But
No,
let's
no,
say it was
but
the
I-
federal government.
yeah,
In the federal government, we're gonna fund, we should be so lucky, some 55 and over housing. And that could be 20% of the units there could be rented to people who didn't have anybody who were
Right.
55 in that, right?
right,
In addition, if you wanted to have a non-55 group, you couldn't have a 55 living next to a non-55. You'd have to
oh, you
have a
mean because you
separate-
would be splitting it, you would, in other words, half would be 80-20 and,
Yes, exactly. This would be
Okay, that's what
80-20, and
I
this would be
wasn't following.
this would be the non-80-20.
okay.
Right.
So does this mean that all your units are gonna be accessible units? They're all gonna be built to be accessible?
I would like them to be, but I'm not the only person who gets to decide, but I'm arguing very hard that they're all accessible, even if the people living there don't need it, so that people can come visit. But that's a really
Well,
important
I'm worried about the
thing.
resale and you keeping up with your 50%.
Say again?
I'm worried about you maintaining the 50%,
Oh.
standard of having at least a 55-year-old or older people. And if they're not all accessible units, how,
Oh,
how
right,
are you
so
gonna
that's
maintain
another
that?
Right, so that's why it has to be.
Bless you.
Excuse me.
Someone could get painted in the corner.
Well, I know, I'm worried about not you guys, the first generation, it's the success of the place
Right.
long-term and, ability of people to sell it, and then, so what if, 4 people have, under 40 purchasers, and, there's one, it's just like, who gets the 55-year-old to be able to make the purchase to keep the place going? I mean,
Well, there must be a way that towns do it, because towns want senior housing. I mean, we're not the first people to have to solve this problem.
Well, that should have been in your ordinance, I think that's something you should have researched ahead of time and written in these types of regulations, instead of saying, here, you deal with it.
And I think that is the advantage of the federal programs, is they're set and they're defined. But
But they're
you,
not funded.
yeah, well, but at least in terms of enforcement and having existed before, it's so that both you and we know what we're dealing with. This is murkier.
Mhm.
It's also, I think, This is some advice, take it or leave it. But you know, when you're presenting, and I'm not talking to us, but like even to the town, it's in your interest for it to be clear. And I mean, the things I
Well,
think we're pointing out are that they're
We
not.
think these are great ideas and hope that this is something that you guys say, what a good idea, we have a housing concern here, and we would really like to allow some sort of multifamily development in town, because lots are just too expensive.
Well, I'll tell
Okay,
you.
let's run with that.
Yeah.
There are some things in here I can't put up with, so what if we put up a similar thing that's all the same, or, you know.
With clarity. and-
With,
yeah.
let's take out, let's take out this and this, and run it against yours.
Mhm.
Then where are we?
We'd withdraw ours.
No, well,
Well-
but Mo, I have broader problems than that. I mean,
Well,
I told you,
I have-
you can go back to the videotape,
Right.
remember Warner Wolf, I don't know whether you know, Eddie, you can look at the videotape. And, you know, I told you the things that sparked my interest, you know, which, I don't have the notes in front of me, but, you know, that I was interested in looking into, that had to do with senior housing, workforce housing, I can't remember the other things, but they're in the minutes and they're on your videotape. But I wanna be deliberate about it and not, it's, you know, the fact that you're in a rush is different than how I feel about it. I wanna do my due, I've been spending an awful lot of time recently, doing my part of the workforce housing update and a town-wide inventory, because I wanna know. I don't wanna take somebody's word for it that Lyme needs X, Y, and Z. I wanna know. So that's what I've been doing, and I think that probably a couple of other people will do it separately. But I'm not gonna jump into this with, you know, under these conditions, and I'm not willing to say, you know, come back in a month and say, give a rewritten thing. Especially, my biggest issue with this is that all those properties, you know, north and south of a mile, are gonna be potentially planned developments, and that's very radical. I am interested, I should say, I'm interested without a conclusion that I would do one thing or another, but I am genuinely interested in finding out what the state of Lyme's housing inventory is, with the potential of making adjustments, with a sense of conviction from the people in the town that that's what they want. So in some sense, you know, in terms of, we would run something against that, I can't imagine that in the month between this.
I don't have anything else to do but sit and write in the zoning.
But you know, but
Or some
even,
holiday season.
I'm a very,
Children are
I'm a very
so-
compulsive person, and I really might do that, but
Uh-huh.
I would have to have conviction to do that, and I don't at this point. And
When we were writing the ordinance to begin with, we worked so hard to get the wording. We would spend 3 hours a night on one page, and we really did. And what's happened ever since then, you go from 6 to 10 amendments to clarify the language. You don't sit down and write this thing in a month. Certainly not in 2 weeks. You've got to have the wording very, very clear. And even that, they'll amend it.
Well, you know, it's.
yeah, the amending is endless, but
Well, all we can say here is that, I mean, we did hire somebody with a lot of planning and zoning experience, and he did, unfortunately, he's on vacation, I couldn't be here tonight. He did his best professional job drafting this.
I'm sure it did.
And you still have questions, and we're not as expert as Jonathan by a long shot, he would be very willing to work with the board and work with you, should you need that to help, because obviously it's very hard to try and come up with something that works for the town, but addresses the multi-unit housing issue. And I know I can say that for him. That's all I can say. Bobby looked at this very carefully, Bobby Hance, the lawyer. But there's nothing that substitutes for this sort of conversation. And that's what I wanna say, we really want that, we feel like we've been asking for this, if we haven't been asking properly, forgive us. This
Okay.
is what we're asking for.
You haven't been asking properly. I have the minutes from the meetings, you have the videos, and there was somebody here last time who said that you're all over the place. And frankly, by the end of some meetings, I'm not really sure what you want or where you're going. You know, the first meeting was about looking in, I think, you know, the subdivision potential, and then it went to zoning amendments. Then I thought you were gonna come back, and then all of a sudden, you were back last time, and then this comes up. My head spins. But in terms of the substance, I've explained myself. I mean, I hope you understand what my interest is, and that for me, it's gotta be based on something I can really point to, and that there is support for and conviction, both that I have conviction for and that the town is demonstrating conviction about. Then I'm interested in investigating without, you know, predetermined outcome.
Well, I think all we can say is that from the beginning, we have wanted to have smaller, attached, clustered units on this property for intergenerational housing. And we wanna do it in a way that Lyme can approve it, and that hasn't changed from day one.
I don't think we should
Right.
go down that road.
So where do we go from here? Do you have other questions?
I just wanna know then, why do you have it so they can all be attached together, the whole thing?
Because when we brought the design in with the common house and an elevator,
The common house with the bridges.
with the bridges,
Between the
people
two
said, oh
buildings.
no, you can't attach the buildings, they have to be separate. And we thought, how am I gonna get people in wheelchairs
Oh,
comfortably
you mean,
inside?
could you just, I missed.
The issue is that if you have two buildings that are of maximum footprint, when you connect that together, they become
then
one.
you're over.
And that's typically
Right.
the way the zoning board has in the past looked at
Right,
any
and
type
I
of
remember we
connection
discussed
between
that at
them.
one of the meetings, and one of the, there was some, feeling, oh, well, that might not be a problem, but then there was a problem with, well, what if you enclose that, and.
Right, and I think, you know, there's always a question of, you know, if you're going to put in bridges between buildings, you know, asking for a variance, you know, it is for a safety reason. It's been approved as a variance in the past by the zoning board for there's one house with a connection between the garage and the house that's covered that would exceed the building footprint because of the two, and the board gave a variance for that because it was felt that it was a safety issue. And so I think that there are, you know, the board could look at it that way.
Right, and of course, cost is an issue if you put an elevator in every building, whereas if you can save the 100,000 or more per building if you can share an elevator.
So I guess I'll be the one.
Can I ask one more question?
Please.
The very last 8, you're changing the amount of open space. Can I ask why?
I think there was some confusion, and in different places it said different things, so we
So-
thought we should be specific here.
Well, and there's that, we wanted to be specific. The other is that in town, where planned developments are currently allowed, the basic deal is, okay, you're gonna use a portion of the lot for your commercial use, a portion of the lot for your residential use. And because you're in town, there's relatively little, it may well consume a considerable fraction of the parcel, and that the town has an interest, we saw the town's interest in saying, just put the remainder of the lot in conservation. And so for a larger lot in the rural district, we said, there may be some other things that you would choose to do. You're still constrained by footprint, you're still constrained by other things, but simply use 75% just as the lot size averaging does. That was the reasoning there, that.
So that would be something for us to think about, you know, what the balance there would be, because part of, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but part of the, what you're getting your planned development, and we would have to think, well, is a 75% adequate? It is different than the current thing. I see what you're saying, the
Right.
smaller areas tend to be smaller. But I mean, on the other hand, for instance, on your property, there's so much in steep slopes that you really probably wouldn't do much with that. You know, it starts to get a little dicey, but that's.
I think too, I mean, certainly one of the constraints is gonna be footprint. And depending on how much you build out the initial buildings up front, that may constrain any further development going forward. So,
You know,
I mean, it's something to
yeah,
talk about.
it's
I mean,
something, it would
that's
be
right.
something we would need to,
Mhm.
I don't think that's
That's not
something
the
big.
size, right?
And,
Just the lot size averaging.
question was also
Like,
about why.
where you got it from.
Right.
Why you use the word may instead of shall, as it was in the original language for, yeah.
We thought that would give the planning board more discretion.
Where's this, Dave?
Number 8.
Which may be protected.
Right, may be protected, it's not a shall be.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that if you're going down to 75%, it should be a shell, but again, that's.
Well, would be nothing to prohibit the planning board from doing that under site plan review, we just thought that would give you more flexibility.
Again, that's something that the public needs to know.
Mhm.
So that perhaps you're better to put the shell in there up front, not depending on the planning board to do it.
Well, it doesn't, I don't know if it's then a taking, if we require that be done. And this says it may be done, it doesn't say that it has to be done.
Mhm.
So if the town were to require that it be done, and people didn't wanna do it, then what?
Huh.
Well, I'm
That's
just saying,
right,
you know, if
yeah.
it doesn't require it,
Uh-huh.
and the town wants it, and the applicant doesn't want to permanently protect the property,
Hmm.
then,
That's a good point.
So if you were writing it, you'd say shall.
well, if the goal is here to protect the open space,
Mhm.
absolutely.
Mhm.
If it's not, then there's no reason to.
And I think it's also a matter of perception is, you know, what are that if you do a planned development in this area in the rural district, you're getting a benefit of only having to, might only have to conserve 75% of the remainder, whereas if you do it in the common district, you will have to.
Mhm.
And so there seems to be a you know, a benefit, or perceived benefit.
Inequity.
Yeah.
I think there's another, both a perceptual and real issue that might be worth thinking about, which is your last amendment was for 26 units and had a 40-acre limitation so that there were, you know,
Yes.
much fewer properties involved. this has a 30 limitation with the 50, with 55 or older, that is a difference, but it's 4 units more. There's no requirement for workforce housing, and way more properties opened up. And
Well, of
those-
course, we couldn't have 30 units on our property.
But 30 units are allowed if
Right.
people
If you have
qualify.
a huge property.
Well, there are big properties here, we don't
I
know.
just wanna be clear that,
But-
the
but this is what it
lot
says.
size limitations still apply.
But this is what it says.
Yeah, right.
So, you could have said 20 or 24, but you said 30.
Well, in case somebody happened to own 200 acres that they wanted to
Well,
develop.
let's not do
Yeah.
that,
Right.
really, please, because I don't accept that at all.
I
So
don't
do you-
wanna upset you, John, but I don't understand why you're saying that.
Because for you to, I pointed out last time that when you say you have 100 acres and you can only build X number, you have 100 acres with a tremendous amount in steep slopes. It's not 100 acres of flat land. My original lot was 4 acres in that go down like that and then 1 acre plateau. I could say, well, I have 5 acres, but 4 of them are meaningless. So that's what I'm saying.
Well, but the argument, one of the overarching arguments that we're making is that, there are 2 things that make it expensive. There's the underlying cost of land, and then there are the constraints of the ordinance. I realize that, it doesn't make sense to build on steep slopes, no kidding. I mean, I'm not suggesting that.
We agree.
And the ordinance actually gives allocations. You got this much steep slope, you can build on, use 20%, I think it is.
Right.
Of that effect, very. The other thing that we're pushing on the ordinance is to say, allowing multiple people to share the cost of the land is gonna allow for more economical, more financially feasible properties.
Well,
And that's-
again, I would say that from my point of view, that may be true. And if I came to that conclusion, it wouldn't necessarily, it might, but it wouldn't necessarily be that, that's where those sort of rights should exist. It might be that an expansion around the existing common somewhere else. So let's just say, if the town felt that was, forget the planning board, but the town felt that was an important thing to do, it wouldn't necessarily lead, it might, but it wouldn't, it isn't, the fact that you happen to own that property doesn't mean that from the town's point of view necessarily, maybe, but necessarily that is the place where that should happen. Maybe the town would think that, but I think that's maybe where a little bit of the disconnect is.
Okay. I understand your point.
Yeah, and it's not, I'm not saying it would definitely be one thing or another, but I hope you would understand that it might be one thing or another.
Okay, any other questions? I mean, we would love, I think we're a broken record, but we would love to see the town come up with some language that would address what we believe and we believe has been presented to the town over years as a problem with moderately priced housing. And of course, it would help us too.
I'll tell you, I spent hours and hours recently working on the the inventory, and I'm not willing to say that these are definitive numbers, but based on what I've seen, Lyme's housing stock does not have a problem with moderately priced housing. It doesn't mean that, I mean, I think moderate priced housing is great, and I'd like to encourage it, but from what I've seen, I have, I don't know, here's the stack. I did a preliminary run-through, and again, I'm not gonna say that these are the definitive numbers, but, what do you consider moderately priced housing?
Well, I think you told us, the results of your work a couple
You know,
weeks
but this
ago.
isn't workforce housing, this is, I'm doing a whole town.
Right, well, I mean, 260 is the
workforce housing.
workforce number, and, I mean, I think that's an interesting metric to say, well, what?
But there's a distinction between workforce and moderate, at least I thought you were making that distinction. Or were you considering workforce housing moderate?
I mean, I think that's a good definition, I mean, the
Okay.
state uses that.
So then
Yeah.
just stick with that.
Right.
What my plan is,
Mhm.
and this is just for me, I'm not speaking for anybody else, is I wanna really get an understanding of the inventory, of what Lyme has, across the board, from workforce housing and from what I consider then the next levels of cost.
Mhm. Okay.
And that will really help me
Mhm.
to put things in perspective and to look for holes, if there are any.
Mhm. Okay.
And from there, I can, at least then I can actually, when you and us or anybody else and us are having conversations, I actually have something concrete to talk about as opposed to, just assertions.
Right.
So that's
That's-
where I'm coming from. I wanna get that done,
Mhm.
and we can all talk about it, and anybody else in the town who wants to talk about it.
And would it be useful for you to have information, for example, from the Upper Valley Housing Coalition? Because they have a lot of data, and then, of course, the planning, your local planning.
The one with all the letters.
Yeah, and they have a great deal
Yeah.
of information.
I have some of that, I'll look at anything, but the thing that I'm really
Mhm.
interested in is Lyme's housing inventory. But I'll look at anything.
And not just the existing inventory, but the ability to develop affordable housing.
The first thing I wanna do is look at what we have.
How much are your units gonna cost?
Well, anything that we make workforce, we will have to subsidize.
No, how
one
much
way
are
or
your
the other.
units gonna cost?
Depends how many units we get, but our working numbers always have been about $199 for a one-bedroom, $299 for a two-bedroom, $399 for a three-bedroom. We had a market study person who said that was feasible.
So 2, 3, and 4, basically,
Well,
if we just
basically,
added.
you
yeah,
finish
right,
it
yeah.
differently.
2, 3, and
you
4.
know, But that's the working numbers.
Do you
Okay,
have
so,
any other questions?
I don't, I think we understand what, if the board were making changes, and not that you would advance anything like this, but that if you were gonna make changes, these were the ones that you would suggest for clarity and for.
You mean the things we pointed out?
Right, the things that you pointed out.
Oh, well, I mean, there's clarity and then there's like, what do you think is the right thing to do? I mean, that's a different thing.
Right, I think there are two
So-
different,
Mhm.
two different
Yeah.
responses you got. One is, how could you make it clearer for
Yeah.
yourselves?
'Cause I have
And then
trouble with
concerns
this
about
section.
the
Well,
approach.
tell us about what.
Well,
right
I don't, I
thing to do.
understand why we have why we have eight there at all with the May. It's not
Well, as I said, I
required.
thought it would be, give the planning board more flexibility, but
Why does the
you-
planning board want more flexibility if what we're supposed to be doing is protecting open space? It doesn't give us the power
so you
necessarily
would
to
change
do it.
that to show.
I would, if that's what you're talking about, and selling this proposal as well, there's gonna be 75% open space protected. if the applicant wants it to be protected, is not discriminating at all.
Now, I read that as if the planning board wants it to be protected.
So you think this says that the planning board can require it to be protected, only if they want it to be protected? Okay, well, and then the others, the being able to glom everything together on 7.
So,
I
right.
was like really not happy to see that. I really don't think that's a great building pattern to have all up and down Route 10.
So, and this is a real question, how would you design a for accessible
Okay, well, what I'm
units?
saying is, we have a standard in our town where we have 6 units that can be in a structure. And having a option out that 7 provides to put 30 altogether, plus all the common buildings, is like way different. It's a huge, it's like, you know, exponential difference in scale. So
And I'm looking for corrections, so you think
So-
if 12 people could share the cost of an elevator, that would work?
I'm not
But-
talking about cost of an elevator, I'm talking about what it looks like in the massing, and what we're talking about in terms of human scale, buildings, living situations for people in this town. I don't know, you know, so, and all of a sudden, we're getting is much gross floor areas you're allowed can all be in essentially one box, which isn't the picture you're showing us, but this
Right.
is what this allows to be developed. So, if not you, somebody else can do it that way. And it puts it on the planning board to tell them they can't do that. And that puts me, sitting as a planning board member, in a very bad position because of how you drafted that. Because I don't think that's our community standard at all. So that makes me really uncomfortable. That's my personal talk. I think it's the first time we've gotten together about this, but that makes me really unhappy. So those 2 things are a huge bother to me.
This is an opportunity for them and
Well,
for
I'm gonna
the-
say it
for
again at the public
board.
hearing, but we can't do anything about this. I'm not gonna sit over Christmas holiday with my kids and redraft this, I'm
Mhm.
not doing that. And I don't think that, I mean, what's the history of amendments in, amendments out? I mean, it's crazy for, you know, so
So
anyway.
how would you define human scale? I mean,
Look around at the buildings that we have here and how many units are in those buildings. And most of the buildings are not new, they were built that
Right.
way.
so
back
basically,
100 years ago.
you're not gonna be, you can't imagine a way for human scale to accomplish, I mean, I'm trying to look for objective criteria. Could you put 2 buildings together? Would that offend you? The
I'm not
sense of
talking about-
human scale,
I'm
you know? I'm just, I'm trying to figure out.
2 buildings together, each having 6 units, that would be better than having the possibility of putting all 6 together and having 30 plus all the common buildings hung off of it, yeah.
So how
This
do
has
I
got
get
no
a
limits
sense of
on that.
what human scale is to you?
Okay, well, I don't have to go like, if I'm up next to the building, I don't have to go like that, or, you know, I can, there's gonna be doorways that tell me that it isn't just one mass and that, they're individual
Because
entrances.
Stu
or-
White came to you 8 years ago with
Mhm.
a design that I think was perfect for Lyme, where they were all attached, it was wings off of a common house. And as an architect, I think he said, this is wonderful human scale, but how do you define human scale? I don't know how to, and that was not something that the
Well,
planning board
was
liked.
that, I'm not sure what
No,
you're
no,
referring to.
Is that what you're going
Trying to
back
get a sense of human scale and.
Look.
What is human scale?
It's a size of it that a person feels comfortable, it's like a domestic situation, it's not skyscrapers, and it's like it's like what we're used to in terms of building size, so that we don't feel dwarfed. I mean, I feel pretty comfortable walking up to the Dowds and their expansion, everything's, it's not too high, the windows are my height, and, I can see, oh, that's a room, that's a room, that's a room, I can, imagine that. I would say the Lyme Inn is a big building. You know, when I get up next to it, I need to look, but, you know, that's, not to say that's not a human scale, but I think that's pretty big. And,
How many rooms are in Lyman?
that's a commercial. I don't know, but, you know, it's just like, so I'm talking about myself.
Okay, how many rooms is, I mean,
In the Lyman, I
is
don't
it
know.
10?
I have no idea.
Something like that, yeah.
14,
Yeah, we've got.
I think there used to be
Let
a
me
lot
put
more
it,
than
let me
that.
put it a different way. First of all, I think I could imagine certain scenarios where, you know, more would be possible. I think I was driving up Route 10 on the way here, and, you know, I got into Lyme, and it is just, it's breathtakingly beautiful driving in. And I was thinking about this on the way in, because what I was looking at is,
Yep.
it was exactly this corridor. So, I mean, this is how I would, I won't use the term human scale, but I would say that, you know, it's pretty hard to end up with a downtown like this. And are people gonna wanna drive through an area where there are multiple relatively very big developments? I don't think they will, really. And I think that's a problem.
when you look at the scale of development in Lyme, you know, you look at, you know, 85 Dartmouth College Highway, you know, again, you have, that's probably one of the biggest developments, but the scale is fairly small, you know, and it mimics the typical New England style downtown, you know, common area, and with buildings around, you know, it kind of mimics the Lyme Common, where you have
And-
relatively small scale buildings.
And that's what I, speaking for myself, I could envision the possibility, this is not something I'm committing to remotely, but I could envision the possibility, for instance, an expansion of, potentially an expansion of the common, where something that mimicked the existing pattern of development, but was substantial and respectful of what's already there in terms of harmony, basically. I could imagine that as acceptable to a lot of people, and potentially to me.
When you say substantial, having a large number of units?
Well,
Is that-
David was referring, for instance, if you took, whatever the address of that is.
13 or 85.
Whatever that, you know,
Right,
if you
yeah.
took that and you transposed or you duplicated,
Mhm.
not duplicated, it's a
Sure,
similar
yeah, yeah.
thing, and, you know, so that as you drove along or you walked along, you wouldn't feel like you ended, how did I get here, and was I just transported, you know, to another town? But that, you're getting your density, you're getting things packed in there, but you don't feel like, what happened?
One of the things that I think we talked about, whoever it was, like 8 years ago, was a Catholic retreat center where I used to run conferences. And the buildings appeared to be separate, but they were all connected underground.
I was just wondering about a tunnel.
Uh-huh.
Is a tunnel easier or harder to build than a bridge?
I think it's a cost issue.
Yeah.
Well, Cobb Villas is all connected by their heating system, and they're separate residences, and some of them are more than one, you know, they're multiple
Right.
family as well, with a common house.
Of course, you can't age in place there, but that's just because of where they're located.
It's on a hillside.
You
Yeah,
can't
yeah.
age in place?
Well, you can
No.
age in
Well,
place.
if you have physical access issues, some of the older people are now moving out,
Right.
unfortunately, because of
Yeah.
the design.
Yeah,
They
well,
said, if we
it's
thought
on
that we
the
were gonna get old when we built this, we would have designed it differently, but
Yeah.
we couldn't imagine it. Right, so, right, a tunnel instead of if that's what I'm asking about with in terms of physical scale, there's a visual image that sort of, you guys would like to recreate
Oh, I don't know.
I know,
I-
yeah, okay.
I've never thought of tunnels, but,
That's one way to solve the.
but one way to solve,
Yeah,
yeah.
one way to solve it,
So
yeah.
that you would
Can't
have,
see it.
And you can have you can have a shared elevator if you go down into the
Right.
basement.
but what you would
It
see
would be a
would
nice
be
basement.
more
Yes,
in context.
right,
I think that's some of the objections that you hear from other, people in town, residents, is, the scale, and just, all of a sudden, you're gonna have this big, huge development right on the edge of the Lyme Common District. And I think-
It is what I hear from people who don't like it, which is the scale and the density. It's-
But I think if the scale was brought back down, the density would follow in place. If,
Likely.
as long as it was not considered, too large a scale,
But
then the density issue could be.
So, yeah, so this is one way of solving it, but we're still running into or I'm running into the issue of, well, are we doing this for you? Or, well, we can do it for the town and get it done for you. But how much, and what is the overall impact, and does the town really want that? Or maybe the town would want it, and there would be a solution that didn't involve your property again, so I mean, these are all considerations.
No, but we're planning to, or this would open up that what is apparently an extremely large number of properties. And as an ordinance, do you want that many big ones? And unfortunately, I personally can't think of any way that you can get yours in there without opening it up to the world.
Yeah, that seems to be an ongoing problem.
Yeah, we were told when we wrote the ordinance that you write it for the worst possible thing that could happen. Well, the worst possible thing in this case is pretty horrendous.
well, this last bit of it was very helpful also.
Good.
So, you'll have to, have a hearing on it, and as I say, we're trying to move forward in a respectful, participatory way, to build,
Well,
Yes,
that's
well,
really
that's-
good of you to say, but how can it be that we can't have input on your proposal if it's participatory? It's not. This is what we got. This is all the voters get to have. At the public hearing, somebody may have a very legitimate concern, and it can't be amended because you're giving it to us now. So it's not participatory. This is what you guys have come up with and what's going to town meeting.
well, when would you guys have
I
to,
think
submit something?
what I was told, I don't know this, but I was told next time. Is that right?
What do you mean next time?
We would have to.
Our final hearing, we have to give something to the town clerk on the first Tuesday in February.
Which is right around the first.
And that means we
Of
would.
February.
Yeah.
Right, and so there's actually possibility for us to have two hearings, one on the 14th and one on the 28th. Possible. We don't have anything to hear then except for this.
So if
So-
people came and said, well,
This
I
can't be
like this,
amended.
but I don't
This
like
can't
that.
be
No, but
amended.
you could propose something. This is, as
Well, we don't
inartfully as
have
we
time to
have done it.
propose anything.
I think the point several people have tried to make is, we're gonna do something like this, if the board is gonna do something like this, it's gonna be very deliberate. We're gonna be going over the words.
Yeah,
It's gonna, I'll tell you something, we had a rough year with amendments. I mean, I can't tell you how much time we put into amendments, and we ended up with 3.
They weren't even the ones we cared about.
We didn't really
frankly.
care about, it was really
So
frustrating.
you even had some that you couldn't
We-
Of our
well,
own.
together.
that
We
couldn't put
couldn't
together.
get them done, because we either couldn't come to a consensus, or we just gave up.
We'll have to do next year.
Yeah, so we already have some for next year. So, I mean, and they don't even come close to this.
If the definition of dwelling unit was
Right, right.
one that
I
could
mean,
not
there's
get a consensus on in time to get it out.
We've got two different definitions
Yeah,
of
so we were
subdivision
trying
and
to-
zoning, so
to-
just like, how can we,
Clarify it so there's just one. So, I mean, this is a huge, huge deal. This is a life changer. From my point of view, number one, I wanna find out, is this what we wanna do? And number two, let's assume everybody on the board says, you know what? This is something that we should do. Even if it was starting here tonight, it would take us a year. Seriously, at least.
well, it'd start out with me saying, I want this to be a multifamily.
And me saying, forget it.
Right, so here we go,
Yeah.
okay?
So that would be the beginning of the
We already
discussion.
know.
And we do try to come to a consensus. I mean, we do bend, sometimes break. But,
He'd pass it when I was away, so make sure of that.
so, I mean, just so you
Okay, that's
understand the
useful to
process,
understand, right.
for something like this, it would take us a year.
Do you think you could do it in a year?
I don't know, because I'm telling you,
I mean, we've waited 10 years.
well, again, I would,
This is our what?
I would not agree,
50th
I would
meeting
not
with you?
agree with that characterization, and I don't wanna get into, you know,
Alright.
we, as human beings, we are always instructed by people who know better than us not to go into history, because it just, you know how that is. So maybe we should just not do that.
But looking forward,
Looking forward, it's a huge project, and we would need to, get, again, information to found it on. We would need to have hearings to see if there was genuine interest, not just,
Single developer.
you're right.
We probably should have some kind of public survey.
Yeah, we would need a survey.
We would need to do an analysis on the properties affected to see what would be
That's right.
the actual
I mean, one of the-
implications of this. That's one of the biggest questions that I think somebody's going to ask, and you don't have that answer. What if every single property were to take advantage of this, what would be the implication to the town?
The maximum build out, basically.
Right.
How would it affect the school? You will get this, believe me, and it's major. Because the taxes are high here, and I can say across the board, it doesn't matter people's financial status. People are not happy with the taxes. And the other thing is, there are people who are paying taxes who are marginally hanging on to being able to stay in line. And there's a lot of talk about, well, we should do this and we should do that to accommodate, workforce housing and stuff. One of the things I wanna make sure is that in the things we do, we're not pushing out people who are just hanging on, who are already here. That's a big concern of mine. So,
I think,
okay?
again, you've been very gracious with your time. We're gonna stop.
See you on the 14th.
Okay.
all right, well, thank you.
Thank you.
And
So, are we gonna have a public hearing on this?
On the 14th?
Yeah.
so we're going ahead with this. All right,
Well, we can't, I mean, we have to.
well, they could withdraw it, it's the only way.
Well, they need to have everybody who signed the petition.
They only have 25 people.
Right, take it off.
No, they all understood that they are all hopeful that the planning board will do something and that they
No,
could withdraw
No,
it.
but Vicky was asking how,
What's the condition?
what are the options? The options are, it could be withdrawn if the 25 people